And it's a warm welcome on this summer's evening in South Africa to you logging on, tuning in wherever you are. Welcome to this Our Burning Planet webinar on oil and gas research in Antarctica, the world's last unmined frontier. Tonight's event is brought to you by APSA, and I'm very happy to say it features Professor Alan Hemmings, one of the world's top experts on Antarctic governance. I'm Tiara Walters, investigative science writer for Daily Maverick, and your host for the next hour. Thanks for joining us. And Alan, hello to you. It's getting dark here on my side, but I think it's 6 a.m. your neck of the woods in New Zealand. Thanks for joining us from the future, so bright and early.
Well, good evening, Tiara. Yes, the sun is well up. The birds are tweeting, so it is a new day here.
Fantastic. Now, if I may, I want to take just 5 minutes to give you, our viewer, some brief insights into our key findings and our rationale for investigating these stories. In these 5 minutes, before we start our formal discussion, we'll also learn more about Alan. And so it was that at the end of October, we released our months-long two-part investigation into bold Russian claims of supergiant oil fields in Antarctica's southern ocean at the bottom of the planet. Rosgeo, Russia's state explorer, had released a statement from the port of Cape Town saying that there were 500 billion barrels of oil and gas beneath Antarctica's fragile waters. That statement was released just as the pandemic swamped world headlines, and so hardly cracked a mention, except in the odd industry report. And it did not say if those reserves were recoverable. But those claims were staggering nonetheless, larger than any country's proved reserves anywhere in the world. And it seemed bizarre to us that apparent commercial prospecting would be taking place in the Antarctic, despite a well-known mining ban. So we investigated, and that's how we came to release the first detailed public record in English, showing Russia had combed the Southern Ocean for oil and gas on an alarming scale after Antarctica's mining ban formally entered into force in 1998. And all this time, we also revealed Russia had been doing so via Cape Town, an Antarctic aerial and shipping gateway city. We also revealed extensive evidence that Rosgeo's Polar Marine Geosurvey expedition had been looking for all kinds of minerals on the Antarctic continent itself, and that was part one. In part two, a story we titled Heat-Pocracy, we dived into the mining ban that may be enabling big oil's blind ambition in the world's last unmined frontier. And we shone a spotlight on the 54-state Antarctic Treaty, the international agreement supposedly designed to govern Antarctica for no purposes but those noble ideals of peace and science. And yet, here we highlighted the contradictions behind this treaty that churns out top climate science, while also letting the rich and powerful probe the Southern Ocean for fossil fuels. But I also want to tell you about Alan's storied and fascinating career as a highly specialized Antarctic academic. Alan, along with other top polar experts, helped me understand why Antarctica is about far more than fisheries, penguins, and climate change. And that's why we couldn't be in better company. Professor Alan Hemmings co-authored the Handbook on the Politics of Antarctica, was commander of the British Antarctic Survey Station during the 1982 Falklands War. He spent time with Greenpeace and the French and New Zealand Antarctic programs. He's a government observer of Antarctic tourism and has traveled across the region. And finally, he has taken part in dozens of treaty meetings, while his current research includes Antarctic geopolitics, the changing world order, and then some. Alan, over to you. As you've so powerfully put it, especially during interviews we've had while researching our investigative series, the very system encouraging us to get off our hydrocarbon habit is in fact also encouraging it. I mean, it's surely bizarre in this day and age that oil and gas research in the Antarctic is legal. How can it be so?
Well, formally, looking for mineral resources in the Antarctic shouldn't really be going on right now. We've had a moratorium on mineral resource activities in place since 1977, when we started negotiating a regime for the formal regulation of mineral resource activities in the Antarctic. Well, that regime was finalized, signed, and it was then abandoned because the international opposition to mining Antarctica was very significant. And in its place, we adopted a new international legal instrument, the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. We often call it the Madrid Protocol for short, which includes an Article 7, which prohibits mineral resource activities apart from scientific research. So we shouldn't actually be conducting prospecting, let alone development, and certainly not extraction from the Antarctic right now. I suppose for the non-Antarctic specialists, the take-home message is perhaps the irony that here we are less than a week out from the Glasgow climate conference. We know we have to get ourselves off the hydrocarbon habit globally. And here we are discussing the fact that we don't seem to have properly closed the door on the idea that we might extract hydrocarbons, oil and gas, from the last untouched part of our planet, the Antarctic.
Alan, perhaps we should just take a step back and set the scene. The Antarctic, as I understand it, covers 1/10 of the Earth, and yet it's also this hauntingly beautiful wilderness at the bottom of the planet that I visited, you visited, but most people will sadly never see the Antarctic. Thus, understandably, they know very little about it. And often in my work as a journalist, I've encountered this misconception, for example, that there are polar bears in Antarctica, when in fact, polar bears live in the Arctic, the far north of the planet. So in a nutshell, which are some of the most surprising myths you've come across when engaging with the public on the subject?
Well, you've touched on the most obvious one, this confusion of the Antarctic with the Arctic. You know, the polar bears. How do the penguins put up with the polar bears? I had one person at a dinner party in England many years ago who came up to me and said, "Look, I'm not stupid. I know there are no polar bears there, but presumably there are still problems for the penguins from the wolves and the foxes." So there is this sort of deeply embedded confusion between the Arctic, where there are all sorts of land animals, including very fierce ones with sharp teeth, and the Antarctic, where essentially the entire ecosystem is dominated by the marine environment. So, you know, the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continents, and the Antarctic is a continent surrounded by ocean. There are no large terrestrial animals at all. In fact, the largest thing is a flightless midge, which is about 5 millimeters long. So no risk to the polar bears. There we go. No risk to the penguins from the midges. Yeah, but I think the striking thing for any of us who've been privileged to go to the Antarctic is the sheer stunning beauty of the place. That will be the thing that you and I will remember all of our days.
Yes. To our audience, just a reminder to you, if you want to submit any question about the future of the world's last unmined frontier, we are talking specifically about this incredible wilderness, about the Antarctic. Please post those questions in the chat window. We are taking questions after this chat. Alan Hemmings is a world expert. I'm almost certain that he can demystify any question you have on the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean, for that matter. Alan, back to you. The Antarctic Treaty has this mining ban, as you've mentioned, or Article 7 as it's called. And according to this, I'm just going to read my notes here. Any activity relating to mineral resources other than scientific research shall be prohibited. So that's it. That's the entire ban. So what would academics consider to be mining activities on the one hand, particularly with regards to prospecting, and what on earth would scientific research be?
Well, right, this is the crux of the issue. The Madrid Protocol just says those very few words about mining in Antarctica. You shan't do it unless you're doing scientific research. There are no definitions of what mineral resource activities are in the Madrid Protocol. But there are in the document that it replaced. And the document that it replaced is this thing, the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities, often referred to by its acronym CRAMRA. Now, this was adopted, but then, as I say, abandoned, and it seems unlikely that it would ever come into force. Now, Chapter 1, the general provisions of this CRAMRA include an article on definitions. And in those definitions, Antarctic mineral resource activities are, quote, prospecting, exploration or development, but does not include scientific research activities with the meaning of Article 3 of the Antarctic Treaty. And then there's a separate definition of prospecting, and it goes into technical details about what prospecting is. Now, since the Madrid Protocol was a response to the unacceptability of this Minerals Convention, the conception of mineral resource activities in CRAMRA is a really good guide to what the Madrid Protocol was trying to regulate. So when the Madrid Protocol says no mineral resource activities apart from scientific research, I think it's reasonable to look back at these definitions here. Now, plainly, the key difference between prospecting and scientific research is your intention. But in CRAMRA, there was an attempt to actually formally separate them out. So people who say, oh, well, it's, you know, there's terrible confusion about the difference between prospecting and scientific research. They're wrong. There's a fairly good guide to what prospecting is in this abandoned treaty. It's a shame that we didn't carry over these definitions into the Madrid Protocol.
Yes.
But after a decade of negotiating the mining convention, abandoning it, and then immediately moving into what became the Madrid Protocol, I don't think anybody thought there was any need to do so. It was blindingly obvious what we meant, and what we meant was written down in black and white in the mining convention, and was the referral point for anybody who cared to look.
Yeah, and it's not just this mining convention, of course. It's widely internationally understood what prospecting is. So looking at oil and gas as a resource, and of course, let's just acknowledge that gas research in the Antarctic can be very useful. So to look at potentially dangerous methane deposits that may escape as the ice sheet shrinks and possibly destabilizes. But also looking at oil and gas as a resource is obviously problematic, especially since now we know Russia has never stopped doing so via Cape Town port since the 1998 mining ban. So, Alan, as an authority in Antarctic governance, how significant would you say this news is that we published recently? And are other countries also doing this?
Well, I think that what your investigation has done so brilliantly is document this sort of long continuation of activities which the Russians themselves have described as prospecting. And it goes back more than 20 years. Now we're celebrating, justifiably, this year, the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Madrid Protocol. But for most of the lifetime of this convention so far, it's open-ended, it can go on for as long as we wish it to. For most of its lifetime, it seems that Russia, which after all is, a significant bipolar power, is an original signatory to the Antarctic Treaty, is not an amateur state when it comes to working in the polar regions, has been doing things which look to be in conflict with the obligations under Article 7 of the Madrid Protocol. And one gets down to sort of very fine discrimination in order to get the Russians off the hook. Now, my suspicion is, and this is a generic issue, when you codify things in international law, success breeds its own problem. And one of those problems is that with time, things get overtaken by technical developments. Now, at one point in time, prospecting probably meant you actually had to do a fairly limited suite of things in order to determine that something was worth going after through further development. But perhaps now you can do a lot of what we understood to be prospecting, use it by integrating a whole load of data sets, doing modeling and whatever. Now, if that is a possibility, and you will have listeners who will be more knowledgeable about the feasibility of that than I, if that's a possibility, then one might be concerned that, in fact, quite a lot of other countries are, notwithstanding Article 7, actively looking at the minerals potential of the Antarctic. Of course, if they're looking at the minerals potential of the Antarctic and they're not doing prospecting, it's perfectly legitimate. The Madrid Protocol doesn't preclude you doing all sorts of things back at home. It really refers to what you're doing in the Antarctic. But I think that we have this kind of paradox. On the one hand, the Antarctic is the source of so much of our critical information about what anthropogenic climate change means for our planet. Lots of the hard data is coming out of the Antarctic. On the other hand, a considerable number of states are kind of hedging their bets about a future when they might be able to dive into the 10% of the planet, which is the Antarctic, and extract more hydrocarbons. I mean, it's a brutal kind of irony. There was a very important paper published in Nature at the beginning of September of this year by Dan Welsby and his colleagues, and it looked at what, as his title described, unextractable fossil fuels in a 1.5 degrees centigrade world. And their suggestion, based upon very careful examination of the data, was that if we want to keep the possibility of remaining below 1.5 degrees centigrade increase by 2050, we have to leave about 60% of the proven hydrocarbon reserves in the world in the ground. Now, the Antarctic has not yet been placed into the arena of proven reserves. But if we've got to leave 60% of what we know about, that we've bounded, we've scoped in the ground, we surely need to leave all of what may be in the ground in the Antarctic in the ground in the Antarctic.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder to you in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question about Antarctic mining threats and politics, please post your questions in the chat window. And if you'd like to sign up to our free Our Burning Planet newsletter, Nicole, our link angel, will share that link. Alan, fundamental to this ban is this number 2048. That is the date when the mining ban can potentially be changed by 3/4 of treaty parties and the ban's 26 original signatories. Thus, the ban does not expire. You've written on this, but it can be changed. And yet, the incredulous might say, but okay, the world is moving into cleaner energy. Why should we care? Or perhaps should we not apply our attention to more immediate threats?
Well, we can try to be optimistic, but we shouldn't take our eye off the ball. I should just say that the 2048 period arises because it was decided when the Madrid Protocol was negotiated that 50 years after it entered into force, it would be possible for a state or states to basically call for a review of the whole thing. That's not in itself not an irregular sort of idea. You see this sort of thing in some other treaties as well. And that 50-year period we reach in 2048. Now, at the point where the protocol was being adopted, 50 years ahead seemed what it is, almost 2 lifetimes away. Yeah. But we're 30 years into that 50 years, and 2048 is no longer so far away for some of us. So it does not need to be triggered. We don't need to get to 2047 or 2048 and decide we're going to, throw this all away. But we can't leave it, in my estimation, until the end of the 2040s before we have the discussion about whether we want to throw it all away. And I think that we are at a point now, 30 years on from the adoption of the protocol, where we are justifiably extremely concerned about our global hydrocarbon habit. And at some point, I think we have to decide conclusively, and I think we should be deciding that now and not leaving it to 2048, that we are never going to take hydrocarbons out of the Antarctic. So if that's not an unreasonable position to be in, then any suggestion that Russia, plus or minus, other states are actively looking at what might be possible in the Antarctic over the next few decades, I think has to be a worry. So to come back to your question, yes, let us hope that there's still a majority of states have no intention and certainly no planning to go mining in Antarctica. But we don't need them all to wish to do that for it to be a problem. And so long as we have some states hedging, I think we have to be alert.
There are other conceivable barriers, though, to mining Antarctica: distance from markets, available technology, and hellishly tough extraction conditions in the world's highest, driest, windiest, stormiest wilderness. Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, they're all those things. So to what extent would you say, Alan, these factors are material barriers to sinking wells in Antarctica somewhere in the future?
Well, they certainly are material barriers. I mean, you've captured it perfectly. I mean, historically, the greatest protections given to the Antarctic were probably not our agreements not to do anything apart from scientific research in relation to mineral resource activities. It was precisely that objective harshness of the Antarctic environment, the remoteness from markets, and the horrendous costs of extracting oil and gas from the Antarctic compared with much cheaper sources closer to home in easier parts of the world. But of course, there was a time when we didn't think deep water off the Amazon basin or the North Sea or deserts were easy places to operate either. And yet we now extract oil and gas from all of those places. So I think that we can't be confident that human ingenuity will not find a way of overcoming technical barriers. But let me add another issue into the mix. The very possibility that at some point we will extract resources from the Antarctic has an immediate effect in the here and now around what states are prepared to see by way of ways of running the Antarctic. So we may or may not wish to extract hydrocarbons from the Antarctic sometime after the middle of the century. But because we haven't resolved that now, it's having an impact on how we run the Antarctic here in 2021. And so it's a complex, as always, a geopolitical issue, as well as a ethical, environmental, climate change issue.
I want to talk to you about how to stop the buck. Alan, the elephant seal in the room, as it were, is where does the buck stop? After all, there are these useful aspects to Antarctic gas research. What then is the most appropriate way for treaty nations to respond to this challenge? I see it also feeds into some of the questions coming through from readers or viewers. Should there be some clear call to action? I think you've already alluded to something like that. And then critically, in your experience, how well is this system equipped to rise to that challenge, especially when we are, an investigative publication like Daily Maverick is putting evidence on the table that the situation is actually quite real and urgent?
Well, I think the first thing, and your investigation has obviously materially contributed to this, is the illuminating that there is an issue, which of course will be news for most people. I think it's entirely reasonable for states to raise this with the Russians or indeed anybody else who they thought was doing something that we seem to have agreed that we wouldn't do. So, and there are formal diplomatic mechanisms for doing that. But I mean, to begin with, the Antarctic Treaty System has two big annual meetings. One of these is concerned with fishery resource activities, but the other one each year, 10 days, is concerned with obligations under the 1959 Antarctic Treaty and under the Madrid Protocol, wherein you find this mining prohibition. So the first thing states can do is actually raise it with Russia through diplomatic communications, and then in the forum of the Antarctic Treaty consultative meeting. But the Madrid Protocol, which is sort of lays out a whole series of duties in relation to the Antarctic, it doesn't just have that minerals prohibition in it. It actually has, towards its rear, it has an arbitration schedule. It has a commitment on the part of the parties to ensure that nobody acts contrary to the letter or principles of the Madrid Protocol and so on. So within the Madrid Protocol itself, there are fairly reasonably carefully bolted down obligations on states to ensure that we do what we say we're doing. Now, if push comes to shove, this could go all the way through to the international arbitration, which is an arbitration schedule. It could go to a referral to the International Court of Justice. Let's hope those sorts of things aren't necessary. States are incredibly reluctant to go to those high-end things, but it's not that we don't have formal mechanisms for doing it. Now, switch to South Africa, or indeed any of the other states which provide the gateways to the Antarctic. They are Ushuaia in Argentina, Punta Arenas in Chile, Cape Town, Hobart in Australia, and Christchurch, where I am now, here in New Zealand. Now, virtually everything that goes in and out of the Antarctic goes in and out via these cities.
Yeah.
So there's also a mechanism for, local exhortation. Ultimately, the countries that allow their ports to be used to go into and out of the Antarctic have particular responsibilities. If it all goes pear-shaped at some stage, South Africa will probably be responsible for coordinating the rescue of anything that happens in the Southern Ocean between South Africa and the Antarctic. So with those sort of duties, I think comes a reasonable basis for saying we need to make sure that we're not facilitating problematical activity.
Yes, and that is where South Africa comes in to an extent. One imagines South Africa has duties and even special responsibilities as, I guess, the only country in Africa that can vote on Antarctica's future under treaty mechanisms. And I just want to repeat that South Africa is the only country in all of Africa, rightly or probably wrongly, with treaty voting powers. Is that a correct assessment, Alan? And if so, what should South Africa do to respond to this moment about our ports being used for highly questionable activities?
Well, you're quite right about South Africa. The continent of Africa is the worst represented part of the planet in the wider Antarctic system. As you say, South Africa is the only decision-making state, what's called an Antarctic Treaty Consultative Party, under the 1959 Antarctic Treaty and under the Madrid Protocol. South Africa was one of the original 12 signatories to the Antarctic Treaty, and the only other African state with any engagement in the Antarctic is Namibia, which is a party to the Marine Living Resources Convention. So that doesn't really help us very much here. So I would have thought, and this is presumptuous of somebody coming from another part of the world, I would have thought that South Africa has a kind of a continental responsibility to speak up for Africa, and perhaps to facilitate a few other African countries becoming parties to the Antarctic Treaty. But as a state which is the kind of the gateway, and Cape Town's an important gateway because you're on essentially in the same time zone as much of Western Europe and the Russians, plus or minus a few hours from New Zealand, where we're sort of 12 hours different from much of Europe. Seems fairly slight to me, but it's certainly one factor which makes Cape Town attractive for the Antarctic tourism industry and for a whole load of programs operating into the Antarctic. So yes. you're a major state, and people pay attention to what South Africa says. So say something.
Well, that is a very clear call to action to our authorities. You just alluded to marine living resources in Antarctica. One of the major problems seems to be this inability by the treaty's Multilateral Fisheries Commission, CAMLR, to reach consensus on creating marine parks in Antarctica. Since the last 1.5 million square kilometer Rossi marine protected area was proclaimed in 2016, most commission members have sworn other new ones are on their way. Great fanfare every year. And yet we see these talks sink year after year because Russia and China are objecting to these proposals. But Alan, if I may be slightly subversive here, are these MPAs worth our effort when vested interests are determining their characteristics, durations and boundaries in the first place? So the Rossi MPA expires in 2051. I think if just one country blocks it, and we can still take obscene amounts of krill out of those waters.
Yes, well, there are imperfections with virtually all protected areas in most parts of the world, right? So this is this comes with the territory, so to speak. There are two marine protected areas in Antarctica. There's one in the South Atlantic sector, south of the South Orkney Islands, and there is this much larger Ross Sea marine protected area. There are at the moment 3 other proposals for the Antarctic Peninsula, for the Weddell Sea, which is the sea on your side of the Antarctic at the bottom of the South Atlantic, and also for East Antarctica. For people who are not Antarctic aficionados, by East Antarctica, we mean the big round bit of the Antarctic away from the hook, which points up towards South America. Now, those 3 proposals have been on the books now for a few years, and they're argued for by a constellation of states. There has been opposition, as you say, to this, perhaps principally from Russia and China. The Antarctic system works on decision making by consensus. Basically, everybody has to agree, and it's very inconvenient when consensus stops something that you or I or the viewers think of as worthy, important, and should be done yesterday. But it was a requirement, essentially, of the claimants and the great powers that enabled the Antarctic Treaty to evolve in the first place. It's a sort of de facto veto. It's very important for the claimants. So there's no getting around it. We have to persist. We have to mobilize arguments, and we have to bring the Russians and Chinese on board, and not just abuse them for being the problem. We have to find ways to creatively engage with them. We have to find a way to creatively engage with each other globally. And if we can't do it in the Antarctic, well, then we're in some difficulties. So it's a place to start, I think. So I wish that those 3 marine protected areas were designated and in place. They're not, and we have a way to go. And it behoves all of us to try and argue that preserving the ecosystem of the Southern Ocean, even preserving the stocks of the fish and krill and squid that we want to harvest rationally, is that project is aided by having a substantial network of marine protected areas around the Antarctic.
I would love to thank you, Alan. You've explained that really clearly. We've had a lot of reader questions come through, and I would love to get into some of those. We have a question from Mark Winslow, a comment and a question. We thought that all these material barriers would stop deep sea mining, but it seems technology is racing to a position that it might be able to do this activity within a few years. And then Mark Winslow asks a question, Alan, and I think it's actually a really good one. It's simple, straight to the point. What's the use of a ban if it can't be enforced?
Well, it's the classic question, and I don't want to be trite about this, but in our domestic environments, we have all sorts of explicit, non-politically contentious prohibitions on human activity, which we see breached every single day. Every society in the world prohibits murder. It doesn't, sadly, prevent murder occurring. Such also occurs in the international system. We sign up to all sorts of obligations, and then we're continually disappointed by our failure to live up to them. What can we do about this? Well, as Churchill said, jaw is better than war. I mean, the counsel of despair you get from some people is that because it's impossible to guarantee full compliance, it's worthless engaging in these talk fests and international legal obligations. Most states comply with most of the obligations most of the time. What attracts our attention, concern, and opprobrium are the egregious breaches. If we see things going on in the Antarctic that we're unhappy with, we have to mobilize to oppose it. And this means our government speaking on our behalf. It means us as individuals protesting to the organization or the country involved. I know this sounds like a kind of feeble suggestion of how to approach this, but we cannot declare war on each other every time we're really irritated by some alleged breach of international obligations.
Right. So we also have a question from Robert White, and Robert says, we've just had COP26 in Glasgow, and no mention of this issue was prominent. We did release our stories at the end of October, so I suppose that's a good question. Was this issue brought up in the discussions among nations involved in Antarctica? Alan, I know that to some extent you followed those discussions as well. So was this issue brought up to your knowledge? And then one might ask, well, why not?
Well, in the last resort, I simply don't know whether it appeared in corridor conversations in Glasgow. Who can tell? I think the general lesson is that we are still not taking anthropogenic climate change seriously enough, because if we were, we would be seriously reining in our use of coal, our search for ever more hydrocarbons, and our inclination to use them when we found them. So I suspect that certainly, so far as I can see, at the formal technical level, no, this didn't come up at all. But I suspect that the Antarctic was only mentioned, if it was mentioned, in terms of the data coming out of Antarctic research about the predicament we've put ourselves in.
And then a question from Nick Jacobs. Nick says, South Africa's government seems to have a tummy relationship with Russia for historical reasons, he says. And then he asks, is it realistic to expect that the government will express any concern, much less outrage, that Russia is basing these unethical activities from our ports? Alan, I think that you've already spoken to that question to some extent, but I guess I think we do seem to have a good relationship with Russia. So from a governance perspective, and you're an expert in governance, what can we expect South Africa to do if it has this really great relationship with Russia? I mean, South Africa is effectively a much smaller country than Russia. So how do we, you said, South Africa, stand up, make your voice heard. What is the most effective way for us to do that? I mean, should we be thinking about some clearer, more specific inspections of vessels that come through our ports? I don't even know how many of these Antarctic vessels are inspected in Antarctic gateway cities.
Well, there are a variety of points to pick up here. I think South Africa is well placed to speak up on this and on other issues. And I'll start with one great moral advantage that South Africa has, aside from being the only authoritative African voice in the Antarctic system. And that is that South Africa is not a claimant in the Antarctic. I mentioned gateway ports in Argentina, Chile, New Zealand and Australia, in addition to Cape Town. All of those other countries claim parts of the Antarctic. And so it's always possible for a state that is in the gun, so to speak, to say, oh, well, really, your interest is a sort of self-interest. You're a territorial claimant. You want to use things like marine protected areas to fence off the Antarctic and to exert some kind of hegemony over an area. Well, this is a charge that cannot be leveled against South Africa. So I think that's a tremendous moral advantage which other of our gateway countries don't have. Secondly, as you say, you have had a productive relationship with Russia for some time. South Africa is in the BRICS group of countries. I think that we have to hope that South Africa's government has the confidence and the weight to speak up. Perhaps it doesn't need to shout from the rooftops initially, but diplomacy is about the art of pursuing the possible on a bilateral basis, as well as international agreements. So it would be good to see South Africa speaking up, and speaking up at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings.
Right. Yes. And of course, it's very difficult for media to access those meetings because they are closed to the public. So, I mean, that is, in terms of a transparency point of view, that is very concerning. So even if South Africa is speaking up, we won't necessarily know about it. I mean, that transparency challenge is a real problem, isn't it, Alan?
Well, it still is to a degree. I think, to be fair, it has improved over the decades. Many countries, and I can't tell you off the top of my head whether South Africa is one of them, do have non-governmental observers and industry representatives, and even, God forbid, journalists on their delegations from time to time. So you would see it on the inside. But the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings' final reports are more transparent and more substantial. Now they generally run to a couple of volumes, sort of telephone directory size, if that isn't itself an obsolete kind of measure of comparison. So it is possible to track what your government says to some level from the reports from the meetings. But being on the inside is even better.
Right, and that is for sure. And may I just add to that Daily Maverick requested access to this year's virtual meeting in France, and our access was denied. The answer that we got from the French was that the meetings are not public, but the opening ceremony will be open to media. Perhaps there were challenges to consider around the fact that this was a virtual event, but one would have hoped that virtual access would have been supplied to media as well. But it's good to know that progress is being made. May I also just correct myself? The question on what's the use of a ban if it can't be enforced came from Paul Barnard, and it was Mark Winslow who made this I think incisive comment. He said, we thought that all these material barriers would stop deep sea mining, but it seems technology is racing to position that this kind of activity might be possible. I think we have time for one more viewer question. And Paul van Doren wanted to know if China is also showing an interest in Antarctica as far as oil and gas are concerned. I would imagine that is what Paul is asking.
Yes, I mean, there have been assertions that China's real interests are in future resource exploitation. That may indeed be one of the bases for their interest. I suspect it's the basis for interest of a whole range of other states, including the United States and Russians, and a whole range of other of our states. The Chinese have not been accused of prospecting in Antarctica for minerals in the way that you've shown the Russians to be doing. So I think that's I mean, very often we lump a bunch of states into sort of one basket and say all the problems are with them. We're honourable people. We are compliant. We are not going to trash the Antarctic. It's those Russians, Chinese, X, Y, Z. We just have to engage. We cannot have a system in the Antarctic in the 2020s and beyond where the Russians and Chinese don't feel any sense of ownership. This isn't a Western system to which they're invited guests. This is part of a global arena in which we all have to find something of ourselves and a kind of common purpose. And our diplomacy has been woeful in ensuring that.
Alan, you make a really excellent point there, and I'm really glad you raised that, because certainly in our research, what we have noticed is that the Russians and Chinese are very much looking at the Antarctic as a resource that can be dynamically used while also being conserved. And Russia has been very vocal about its compliance to Antarctic treaty laws. It has implemented a raft of domestic laws on Antarctic governance. So there is certainly, one might even argue, valid worldviews at play here, and they are certainly conflicting, although when it comes to validity, scientifically speaking, one cannot argue with the fact that oil and gas need to stay in the ground, and we certainly, it just does not seem logical to be sizing up the Antarctic continent for other resources such as gold and coal and so on. So I guess that's more of a comment than a question. But Alan, if you have any thoughts on that, I think I have one more question for you in terms of closing comments.
Well, one of the earlier questions I don't think I answered very well was in relation to the sort of deep sea bed and so on within the Antarctic area. The Antarctic is not just the continent, but this marine area around it. And because of the sort of juridical ambiguities around the Antarctic, we don't have internationally recognized maritime zones. So the law of the sea will see the high seas coming right up to the coastline of the Antarctic for most states, not the claimants. And the Deep Sea Bed Authority has an interest in very large areas within the Antarctic Treaty Area. We've got a problem potentially of a sort of conflict of jurisdictions between the Antarctic Treaty System, which under its Article 7 says no mineral resource activities apart from scientific research, and the International Seabed Authority that can assign rights or recognize rights to parts of the seabed upon application by particular states or groups of states. So we have the possibility that we will see perhaps the first challenge to minerals activity in the Antarctic not arising in a direct breach of the Madrid Protocol, but by through states exploring their rights under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to exploit the deep seabed. And how that shakes out is uncertain. All you can say is that so long as the Antarctic system is opposed in principle, if not always in the practice, to mineral resource activities in the Antarctic, the fact that we've got the permanent 5 of the Security Council as members of the Antarctic Treaty suggests that the Antarctic system could put a damper on the exploitation of the Antarctic through the route of the deep seabed. But, you know, this is uncertain territory in every sense of the word.
And there has to be some conflict about this within Russian Antarctic circles themselves. They are not here to speak for themselves. However, what one can point out is that they are producing good climate science. There are some top Russian climate scientists contributing to the IPCC report. So this, as you say, Alan, it's not a clear cut issue of us versus them. It's a very complex issue on which we must engage, and Daily Maverick feels very grateful to be part of this conversation and to help push, hopefully, some engagement forward and help shift this critical conversation. Some closing remarks, Alan. All these issues are naturally concerning when seen through the filters of a scientific, political and moral integrity. But there is another issue, and that is acknowledging the first residents of the Antarctic, the whales, penguins, seals, birds, and this very rich archive of life that persists there, regardless of all we throw at it. To what extent can we prioritize the value of nature in and of itself when making policy decisions about a sensitive region that many countries view as, I guess, a rational resource to be secured and extracted? And what critically do we stand to lose if we don't?
Yes. How long have you got?
We might use another webinar.
Yeah. I suppose if you looked at the Antarctic system overall, you'd say that the environment has historically been viewed in instrumental terms. And in fact, under the Antarctic Marine Living Resources Convention, there's explicit reference to sort of rational use. Conservation includes rational use, according to Kemmler. Historically, under the Antarctic Treaty and under the Madrid Protocol, we haven't explicitly referred to rational use. It's been implicit, but it's not been explicit. In the Madrid Protocol, there's a commitment to intrinsic value and other wilderness and aesthetic values. So there's the beginnings of a wider environmental consciousness, a wider ethical consciousness in the Madrid Protocol. But I would have to say we've not operationalized it very effectively. So, but there are toeholds there. So if you look ahead for how you would make an argument for a more a deep ecology kind of engagement with the Antarctic, we have some hooks that we can put things on. But in a world where we are seeing increasingly and positively the attribution of rights, personhood to things like rivers and mountains, potentially to higher sentient mammals apart from ourselves, who don't always seem entirely sentient. Perhaps we could see that kind of thing developing in the Antarctic too, that we give some kind of rights to the Antarctic as a place. And that would be congruent with the views of First Peoples around the world towards their natural environment, and increasingly their sense that the whole world also belongs to them, that they're not just parked on the side of civilization while the rich white folk carve it up and use it for their purposes. So I think there's a sort of basis for hope. And let me finish by saying, one sees many problems in the Antarctic, but it is the only continent on our planet where we haven't butchered each other. So that gives us some reasonable basis for hope, and well, for, I think, also a duty to ensure that that continues to be the case.
And in our conversations, Alan, you mentioned something incredibly moving, and that is that some long-lived animals that are existing right now in the Antarctic, I think you mentioned Weddell seals, some birds, might be alive in 2048, or might at least have a generation attached to them. So that really just brings it home in terms of the immediacy of the issue.
It does indeed. I mean, birds, seals, whales, flying, swimming around the Antarctic today will be alive in 2048. So it has that kind of tangible thing. It's within the lifetime of some individual animals in the Antarctic, what we call charismatic megafauna, the kind of things that we're all impressed with when we see. Those things will be the animals at risk if we get things wrong within our lifetimes, within their lifetimes.
Alan, thank you for that. I think it's safe to say that the Antarctic Treaty is the best agreement of its kind, and it would be